Okay, we're back. Hey, Alex, I know you were having a little technical difficulty right before the show started when we were talking, but we're good to go and we're live, man. How's
Yes.
it going? I'll say this on the air. We've already asked each other these things behind closed doors, but how's it going, Alex?
Everything going well. Thank you for having me, Rashid.
Nope.
Always a pleasure to join you.
Man, I always when things are like really out there and you can't make heads or tails of it, especially with the policies of Europe or NATO. I always go back to use the default button, and I know you have your hand on the temperature on the ground in Europe, and what is it like right now for the average European with the sanctions on Russia and the constant provocation of Russia?
Well, things are slowly deteriorating. I think that we're watching a slow motion train wreck in progress. And, so from day to day, nothing particularly spectacular happens on that front. But, if you look at the aggregates, if you look at the statistics, you see that the Germany is rapidly deindustrializing. Germany's industrial production has declined by, I think, a little bit over 10% since the beginning of the special military operation in February 2022. The GDP growth across Europe is extremely sluggish to negative. The government deficits, debts, they're all going up and growing. The central banks are responding in the only way that they know how to, which is by printing money and flooding the economy with a fake liquidity, with real liquidity, but backed by nothing. It's fake in that sense. And we see that Europe is sustaining tremendous damage from the sanctions on Russia, but not only. I would say we're looking at a confluence of a perfect storm, because we have sanctions on Russia. We have tens of billions of dollars that are being handed over to an illegitimate, super corrupt regime in Ukraine by the European Union, by Japan, by all the Western nations. And then we see that their economy is suffering from it, for it. I don't know what the damage is, but I saw the other day a staggering chart of a very old German industrial giant called the ThyssenKrupp. So in the last 2 years, it's gone from, its enterprise value has gone from about $20 billion to negative $100 million, or euros. I'm sorry, euros. What does that tell us? It tells us that the German industry and European industry in general, they've become uncompetitive. So, whereas before the sanctions and when they had access to abundant, cheap Russian oil and gas, they were competitive. They were successful exporters. They were successful traders. They employed a lot of people. They produced a lot of goods. They contributed to the German economy. Today, they're no longer competitive. They're losing out. They are actually creating negative economic value. We don't know exactly what the damage is, but if we take European Union's High Representative for Foreign Policy, Joseph Borrell, at his word, he said that the damage from the sanctions is 10 times the amounts that have been given to Ukraine in military and financial support. So the number he mentioned was 700 billion euros. Okay, so that's absolutely massive. And so, governments and countries that are the most on the hook for this collapse will be, again, most of the Western nations, and I think that probably the United States least of all. But from where I sit, it seems to me that Great Britain has been at the forefront, the leading, the cheerleader of this project Ukraine, and in part they've attempted to lead by example. So they've been one of the most generous contributors to Ukraine's proxy war against Russia. And so it seems to me that we're not far from some kind of a collapse situation, and we see that the monetary authorities are trying to front run that collapse by simply printing money and flooding it into the system. So whereas the bad debts that are on the books of European financial institutions could completely collapse the system, the central banks are going the way of providing liquidity in the form of, now, Bank of England has pretty much announced a repo program. That
Mm-hmm.
repo has ballooned to 40 billion pounds. And what that basically means for anybody who doesn't remember the repo crisis of 2019 in the United States, it means that one of the banks, or more than one bank in the system, is actually broke, and that it would shut down, and we would see bank runs. But in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, they have launched this repo program where they just simply provide all the liquidity that's necessary for these institutions to stay in business. What that means for you and I, well, maybe you to a lesser extent because you're in the United States, but what it means for the people in Europe, the Germans, the French, the British, and so forth, is that they're going to wake up one day to an accelerating rate of inflation. They're going to be waking up to dramatically reduced standards of living. And then what happens alongside of all these bad developments is that governments turn increasingly authoritarian and draconian in order to keep the people in check, to avoid some kind of a violent revolution that could upend their system.
Well, with all of this said, with all the think tanks, with all of the money that goes into government and all of these different quote unquote organizations, they didn't have the foresight to see that these knee jerk sanctions against Russia would bring about this economic harm, especially when you're receiving 40% of your oil or your gas from Russia, and then you're receiving a huge amount of your commodities from Russia. They didn't sit down to think about this. It seems to me that shows a lack of strategic depth, strategic thinking, and a lack of I like it's hard for me to find a way. It's a strategic depth and strategic thinking. I'll put it like that. Why would they, in so many words, be so willing to commit economic and political suicide?
I think it was a gamble. They knew, but they chose to ignore what they knew. Because remember, already back in 2014, Barack Obama declined to escalate the situation with Russia past the point where it already was. And we saw peace negotiations. We saw the Minsk I agreement, Minsk II agreement. Of course, the Western sides never had any intention of honoring those agreements, but at the very least, they stopped the escalation in its tracks. And the reason why is because Obama and his advisors understood that Russia has an escalatory dominance in this region, and that in case of a military clash, that Russia would prevail. That didn't change. But I think that what people in power decided to do this time is they decided to throw the kitchen sink at the problem, to gamble that they might prevail. And they took extremely reckless risks with all of our futures, and they thought that if they provoked Russia into a military confrontation, and then responded to that, to their attack on Ukraine with these nuclear total sanctions, that Russia's economy would suffer so severely that the Russian people would rise up and overthrow Vladimir Putin for them. And if that happened, then they would go in, they would negotiate a peace settlement, they would demand new elections for Russia, they would finagle those elections to make sure that one of their favored candidates ended up in the Kremlin. And if they were successful with this, then they would get all the oil and all the gas and all the other resources at far, far favorable terms. I'm not talking necessarily about the price, but the fact that it would be, rather than Russian banks financing the development of Russian economy and Russian corporations developing its natural resources, it would be Western corporations, it would be Western banks, and Western financial interests would be picking up the pieces of Russian economy for pennies on the dollars, as they have done in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would get everything, an estimated 75 to 90 trillion dollars worth of resource wealth, plus about 150 million Russians, which constitute the world's best educated labor force, and they would be able to exploit them in the same way that they have done in the past, and as they have done with other colonial dependencies through history. And so this was an enticing enough prospect for them that they were willing to gamble to win. And so they knew what they were doing. They knew the risks that they were taking, but they gambled on the notion that they would be successful, that they would prevail, that Russia is weak, that its political system is fragile, and that if they could provoke Russia into a war and devastate its economy, that they would get a regime change there, and then they would get everything they wanted. It didn't work out that way, but they will make sure that we, the ordinary people, pay the price for their gamble and not them.
In line with that, I want to play something for you. It's in line with what you were just saying, and it's a short clip, and it's a Freudian slip, but it's a slip nonetheless with one of the senators in the U.S. Congress. And how he views Africa and America's policy towards Africa. It is pretty much identical to what you said about what the West wanted with Russia, to break Russia's economy, to get the strategic assets for pennies on the dollar, and they were willing to do any and everything to do it. And I want you, and because this thought is pervasive across the power spectrum of the West, and how they view everybody else as prey, and they are the hunters. So I want you to listen to this. This is about 19 seconds.
How can we help foster the public-private partnerships, bringing American capital and expertise and standards to Africa, so that we can keep exploiting, so that we can exploring where we can get these minerals?
Exploring. What's the fuss? It's exploring, science and geology, geography, learning about the world. That's what he meant.
I mean, it was. I mean, he said, so we can keep exploiting, and then he said, exploring.
Yeah. It was a good save. It was a good save. He could have said exploding, and then he'd be in a lot of trouble. It was a good save. No, but yeah, obviously, when they slip up like this, they just reveal the mindset, because they meet in these think tanks, they read these reports, and this is what it's talking about. It's been true since forever. When we got a hold of the Pentagon Papers, Howard Zinn wrote about this. It was all about tin, oil, rubber, natural resources. It was never about fighting communism. It was never about democracy, human rights, freedom. That's the same as in centuries past. It was never about civilizing the savages in Africa and Asia and South America. It was never about bringing Christianity to the Indians and to the South American natives. It was always about resources. It was always about wealth. And it has always been completely and entirely ruthless, to the point where, once upon a time, they would completely replace populations of places like Haiti, because Haiti had a population of American natives living there in, presumably in nice harmony with nature and with the resources they exploited for their survival. And then, the French colonialists came in, and when these natives didn't want to work as slaves for them on sugar and coffee and tobacco plantations, they just simply killed them all and replaced them with tens of thousands of African slaves. And to this very day, Haiti is suffering the consequences of that. And still they're being, the Western, imperial colonialist system is imposing the very same ruthless system of exploitations on them. It's only dressed up differently, because they discovered that, in the past they had to send their colonialists with guns, with horses, ready, willing, and able to suppress any kind of a liberation movement. And then they later discovered that they can simply plunge these nations into financial debt. They could appoint local rulers, corrupt them, and then rely on the locals to repress other locals and, create these policies of divide and conquer. And then every country would be ruled by some kind of a corrupt type Zelensky, Juan Guaido, whatever you have, leader. And they would do the repressing for them, and the West would simply maybe provide them just the weaponry, the ammunition, the technology for repressing the local population. And in exchange for villas in Florida and Tuscany and yachts in the Mediterranean, they would do all the dirty work for them. And this is going on to this very day, which fortunately I think is coming to an end, because we're seeing increasingly African countries reassert their sovereignty and kick out the French and American colonizers and start to renationalize their natural wealth. And hopefully this process will continue, and it will be able to put the colonialist imperial system where it belongs, into the dustbin of history.
Alex, it's crazy how the mantras they change, but they stay the same. As you were saying, as you were hinting, and you were talking earlier about how it goes from civilizing the quote unquote savages to bringing the Christianity to the savages to democracy, to fighting communism, to fighting dictators and tyrants, and how all of it is a plan. It masks their plans of total domination at all costs. I want to ask you, since we're on this subject, why aren't these people classified as megalomaniacs or sociopaths? Because to have a mind where the top priority always is financial, the top priority always is material gain, and lives are expendable to get that. To me, those are people those are the savages.
Yeah, absolutely. But, they just simply call themselves philanthropists. And there you have it. That's, they're philanthropists, and they're doing good deeds, except that we just don't understand it because we're such simpletons. and we don't understand that they're fighting viruses for us and they're fighting climate change for us. You know, the rationale for what they're doing and why they're doing it keeps changing, but the logic, the economic logic of it remains the same. And I'm going. The logic of it goes back 2,000 years, and I'll read for you. Give me a second to find it. A quote from Cicero from 66 BC. So here's what Cicero wrote in 66 BC, and he was referring to Eastern Mediterranean and Asia Minor, which was colonized by by the Roman Empire at the time. And so he wrote that if some lose their whole fortunes, they will drag many more down with them. Believe me, that the whole system of credit and finance, which is carried on here in the Forum, is inextricably bound up with the revenues of the Asiatic province. If those revenues are destroyed, our whole system of credit will come down with a crash. So, if you take this quote and you replace the Asiatic province with, the Middle East, Eurasian continent in general, and other colonial possession, and if you replace finance, which is carried on here in the Forum, with finance, which is carried out in the City of London and on Wall Street, the same exact logic holds true 2,090 years later. It's the same system. It's just changed decorum. It's changed form. The fashions changed. They no longer wear togas. They wear, nice fancy suits and all this. But yeah, you're right. They are savages in expensive suits. That's what they are. And there's all they have is ideology to try to hide behind it.
So again, now I'm gonna be a little bit here, a little bit there, because I want to address a couple things. Where are we with the Israeli Palestinian crisis? And the reason I say that is because since we're talking on finance, you know that the Israeli economy is in a tailspin, and the only thing that's keeping it afloat is injections of aid from the United States and the European Union, and the only way the Israeli regime can continue its war of aggression is the 500 plus shipments of weapons from the United States alone. So where are we with that? Because this is unsustainable for Europe. This is unsustainable for Israel. This is unsustainable for the so-called world's only superpower, because all three are essentially bankrupt.
Yeah, I think the one thing that collapsed with the events in Israel over the past 10, 11 months is the illusion that Israel was ever about having a homeland for the Jewish people. It was always an imperial project. And, it goes back to Halford Mackinder, where he wanted to rule Eurasian landmass, when he wanted to surround the pivot area and the pivot power, which he at the time identified most likely as Russia. So the British imperial establishment were afraid of a land-based power of emerging in the pivot area of the Eurasian landmass, and they expected that Russia would be that power. And their strategy to prevent Russia from emerging as a rival power to the British Empire is to surround it with a number of beachheads. Back in the day, in 1904, when Halford Mackinder wrote this geographical pivot of history, he was talking about Italy, about France, about India, about Korea as those beachheads. But in the decades since, they cultivated Ukraine, they created Israel, and then they divided India into Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and so they did this with the view of using all those countries. And Halford Mackinder explicitly wrote this in his treatises. He the idea was that the Western navies would supply war material to the land-based army of these powers, these continental powers, and then have those powers wage wars against the pivot power, i.e. Russia, in order to keep it weak, keep it constantly fighting quagmire wars, and so that the British Empire could maintain their hegemony over the Eurasian landmass. Same thing is going on today, except the geographies, not the geography, but the geopolitics have changed a little bit. And Israel is one of those things. So it was never meant as a homeland for the Jewish people. That was merely the acceptable, let's say, an acceptable rationale for expelling Palestinian peoples from their homeland and wiping it off the map. But now this project is sinking, same as Ukraine is. And so, of course, they will not give up, because giving up on Israel equals giving up on the wealth, on the resource wealth of the Middle Eastern region, of the whole region. They will lose control over it, and what that means is that they will lose the ability to control the collateral, which then translates into financialist flows in the Western financial system. So they will try to defend it to the end, but of course, again, when this gentleman, I don't remember his name, that you showed the video clip where he says, like, oh, we have to continue exploiting these resources.
Senator Todd Young.
Oh, okay, Todd Young. So Todd Young also mentioned the thing called private-public partnership. What that means is that the private stakeholders take the profits from these arrangements. They take all the benefits. But if things go sour, then the public pays the cost. The public pays the cost in terms of military enforcement of this system of governance, of this colonial system. And they pick up the tab if if things go south. And what that means is that, all this aid that's flowing to Israel and to Ukraine is going to be borne by the ordinary people of Western nations, of the United States, of Canada, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, all of the nations that are in this, let's call it Euro-Atlanticist alliance. And then if they happen to win, then the benefits will accrue to the imperial vested interests, which is a very, very, very small segment of our populations, and they are usually, they are invariably the moneylender interests. It's the international banking cartel, and the defense of Israel, because they have no downside to it. If we pay the bill and they take the profits, they don't really have downside. Right. So they will defend it to the end. What they're worried about is that we all rebel, and that the French people whip out the guillotines back, and the Germans rebel, that the British rebel. So they have to repress the populations at home, which is why now you're seeing very draconian new restrictions on the freedom of speech, of freedom of gathering, freedom to protest. They're trying to pen us into 15-minute cities. They want us all to have a digital ID connected to our smart devices so that they could track where we are at every moment, so that they could see immediately if we're planning to do something naughty, if we're getting all uppity, and that they could squash any freedom movement. But history is, let's say that the track record in history of such endeavors it has a very poor outcomes, very poor prognosis. Every empire in history has collapsed, and so will this one. And then it's just a question of what end these people are going to meet. But I have the impression that they will come to no good end, because we know too much now. And, once you've seen all this, there's no unseeing it.
Mm-hmm. I want to go to the chat real quick. We have one of my channel members, Mehdi, says he has a question for you. Do you think that the West will realize that countries like China and Russia have a geological advantage? I think it means geopolitical advantage over the West in terms of logistics and resupply in these regions.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we were talking about a few minutes ago. I think that they do realize it. They just don't want to accept it. So, I'll give you a concrete example. There was a German admiral of the Navy. His name was Kai Arno Schonbach, and at some point in 2019, I think, or maybe even later, but definitely before the beginning of war in Ukraine, he was at some kind of a military exercise in India, and he was in a meeting with other Indian and military representatives from other countries. And he said basically, well, the lowest cost solution to this crisis with Russia is to treat Russia with respect and to recognize that they do have legitimate security concerns in Ukraine, and to make an arrangement that takes those concerns into consideration. Well, his military career ended that same day. So what that tells you is that there are many people in the West who understand all these things, but they are being eliminated because only the people who are ready to set the world on fire and plunge us all into a nuclear holocaust are allowed to stay in the positions of power. Everybody else is being purged. So, back to the answer, yes, people do understand it, but they don't wish to accept it because they have made the arrangement for themselves where if they gamble to their favor and they win, they get the spoils. If they lose, we pay the losses. So they have no incentives to turn back. They have no incentives to find a reasonable solution to these problems. They will just keep on, like a drunken gambler, gambling away, and they don't care if the whole world comes to a bad end, because they perceive that they have no downside in it.
Alex, you have some articles on Substack, and one is the slow dying of American democracy, and another one is the coming collapse of Britain. Could you elaborate on what was your mind process when you were writing those two articles?
Well, I'm just observing the changes in the political systems that are becoming apparent now to everybody. They're not necessarily changes. It's just that certain things can no longer be hidden. I've been very negative about this Western liberal democracy business for a very, very long time. But, it seemed to be reasonable. It seemed that we had peace for so many years in the period post Second World War, that we have these wonderful liberal democracies where people decide policy and blah, 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 all of this. Except it never really was true. And so one thing that I was surprised about is that the Democratic Party was brazen enough to nominate Kamala Harris as the presidential candidate without doing the primary elections. Once Joe Biden was out, there were supposed to be primaries so that people can decide who's going to be the candidate of the party in the presidential elections. Well, they just skipped that and nominated Kamala Harris, who never won a single candidate in the primaries in 2020. So she's extremely unpopular. She has no accomplishments to her name other than slamming a lot of black people into prison and keeping them there past their release date, and hiding exculpatory evidence and all of those things that we know about. So if you're setting up for an election of such a completely incompetent, highly unpopular, toxic candidate to be your party's presidential candidate for 2024 elections, that is proof positive that you are intent on cheating and stealing the election. Otherwise, that would be suicidal. You would be simply setting yourself up for defeat. If the elections were how do you call it, fair and transparent. So, obviously they're planning to cheat. So obviously they have complete contempt for the democratic will of the American people. And so that puts a lie to the idea that we live in a democratic system. And then, we also see that in France, just yesterday, 60 days after the French people voted in the elections, Emmanuel Macron finally deemed it appropriate to nominate the new prime minister. Well, he was supposed to nominate a prime minister from the party that won the election, but he nominated a prime minister from a party that came in number 4, and which won only 5% of the popular vote in France. So he simply told the French people, you voted wrong. I'm going to nominate the person I think is best, and it's a figurative spit in the face of 95% of the French people who voted for other candidates. And so I don't know what the consequences will be, but obviously this has nothing to do with democracy. And then same thing in Britain. Keir Starmer is extremely unpopular. He was, the way these British prime ministers come into the office and get to form cabinets has nothing to do with democracy either. Everybody hates Keir Starmer in the UK, but nevertheless, he's the prime minister, and he's still promising. He's cutting the heating subsidies to the British pensioners. And if people don't know what this means, the cold kills about 10 times as many old people as the heat in the summer. Like when you have those heat waves and it kills a bunch of old people, well, the cold kills 10 times as many. So he cut their fuel subsidies. Yet at the very same time, he's promising much, much more money to continue supporting Ukraine, to continue supporting Israel, to continue supporting these cockamamie net zero energy policies and so forth. So it's this is no democracy, because no people would choose any of these policies from their government if their votes actually counted.
With the coming collapse of Britain, you point out about some of the horrific cliff edge, avalanche of debt, I believe, and the defaults that are coming. And you and I were talking before we got on the air about in America, and how America, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of companies are shutting down, and a lot of banks are closing, and we have a lot of shipping companies laying off and going bankrupt. Does this signal something that's right over the horizon that will be devastating to the Western man on the street, woman on the street? Will this be a life-changing event that's underway economically?
Yes, I think it's already going on. I mean, all you have to do is drive around the cities of the United States. Baltimore, Phoenix, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, Santa Monica. Everywhere you go, you see these hordes of homeless people, these young men and women who are drugged out of their heads. This is already happening, and it's only going to be getting worse. And so what's it going to take to change things around? I think it might have to be a revolution, but who knows? Maybe the elections are going to change something for the better. Although I very much doubt it. This system is so entrenched and ossified. It will be extremely difficult to change it through the institutions of the system, because these institutions have a very, very long continuity. and they were designed exactly to keep the status quo intact. So, even if Donald Trump wins the elections, I think that he will be able to improve things a little bit on the margins. It will take much, much more radical changes for things to happen for real. Alternatively, maybe the system is going to go on as is. It's going to be losing its vitality. It's going, the economy is going to be growing weaker and weaker. The government is going to be growing less and less effective. But what's going to happen maybe is that people are going to be organizing black markets and gray markets where they're going to procure for themselves what they need, where they're going to be supplying the goods that they can supply to the system, or where they're going to be trading in, let's call it, illegal currencies, whether it's going to be US dollars, cash, whether it's going to be gold and silver coin or Bitcoin, or, packets of cigarettes or whatever it be. But, this is what often happens when people don't have a way out. They simply opt out and they create their own system of exchange where, rather than languishing on the streets and slowly dying, they just do what they can and what they are able to with the means that they're at their disposal. And, when we talk about the means that they're at their disposal, that, that includes theft as well from the other system, from the legal system. So if you can't afford fuel, maybe, one of your neighbors might steal a tanker or two here and there and, give it to you in exchange for Bitcoin or whatever you have. But these things happen for real. We got used to hearing these stories from the third world, but, third world is here now. And so, maybe we'll get a revolution, or maybe we're just going to get people opting out and creating an alternative system on the ruins of the existing system. We don't know. We'll just have to find out.
I want to play for you a clip. I played this clip on one of my previous shows, but it's talking about the alarm raised over skyrocketing debt. It's about 4 minutes. I want you to pay attention to this, and I want your assessment after this, because the reason I want to play this clip is because America can always find money for war. She can always find sign appropriation bills and supplemental bills to put aid packages for war and for color revolutions and to prop up illegitimate governments. But when it comes to her people, when it comes to her taxpayers, when it comes to the man and woman on the street, or the people who have sacrificed in her military, she turns a blind eye, a deaf ear, and a dumb tongue to them. I want you to listen to this real quick.
Russian forces continue to repel Ukraine's attempts to move deeper into the billions of dollars being sent to Ukraine is one factor contributing to the current state of the U.S. economy. American billionaire and investor Leon Cooperman has stated a meltdown appears imminent because of the fast-growing national debt stateside.
We're heading towards a fiscal disaster in our country. There's nobody focusing on the debt creation in the economy. In 2017, the national debt of the country, I think, was 17 trillion. 5 years, wait a minute, not 5 years. Yeah, it's about 5 years later. We're knocking on the door, 7 years later. So I'm a little slow this morning. So currently the debt is about 34, 35 trillion. It's a growth rate in debt far in excess of growth rate of the economy. I think we're pulling demand forward, and neither political party is focused on this.
He brings up, if anyone ever watched that full interview, he brings up a lot more about just this kind of audacious spending spree that the US has been on for a while. I mean, if we just look at the numbers that the US spends on foreign conflicts, for example, right? Since 2022, the US has given $55.4 billion to Ukraine, and Israel $150 billion since the 90s. This, bear in mind, at a point when we heard yesterday that the US's own federal disaster budget has essentially run out of money. It's gone. It's disappeared into thin air, or it's all been spent. It's incredibly worrying. I mean, we're seeing not just Cooperman, but we're also seeing large US corporations, companies and businessmen divesting themselves of their own economy. I mean, if we look at Berkshire Hathaway, which a lot of people know, owned by the famous, the infamous Warren Buffett, if we look at the numbers there, they've moved so much into cash in this last quarter. They've been selling off half of their entire Apple stock, which is probably one of the US's highest performing stocks over the last 20 years. Half of their stock, which is absolutely huge. And their balance sheet right now, $189 billion they're holding in cash. And that means that's dead money, essentially, Union. That's money that they're just holding that's not being reinvested into the economy in things like government bonds, in things like US stocks, equities, shares, all stuff like that. They've literally just pulled that money out and they're holding basically a war chest. And I think that really tells us exactly where the economy is and probably signs of what's to come. The IMF, let's say, is no real friend to Russia, China, or any of the so-called multipolar world, are forecasting that the global economy, they're saying that, national debt of the global economy, the US being the largest economy in the world, pretty much, unfortunately, every economy in the world is going to follow suit. There'll be a domino effect. 140% GDP per capita to debt ratio, which is absolutely massive. In fact, I think we've got a clip, Union, we can see of what the IMF are actually warning. Okay.
High deficits and debt create a growing risk for the U.S. and the global economy, potentially feeding into higher fiscal financing costs. The ongoing expansion of trade restrictions and insufficient progress in addressing the vulnerabilities both pose important downside risks.
And again, we've seen other countries heed that advice. Say China, a lot of people don't know this, but China holds a huge amount of US dollar bonds. That's basically US debt that China has lent the US government, in spite of what they say and all their, their propaganda about China. They're really in the hole with China. They owe China a lot of money in US bonds. They've sold $50 billion of their US Treasury bonds this summer, which is probably more than they've sold in a very, very long time. And then we've got the other issue of, all of the sanctions the US has put on Russia, putting it now looking like it under a Trump administration, getting even worse on China. And that's just damaging the economy. More importantly, Union, we talk about it a lot in this program, it's damaging the greenback, the US dollar, which is one of the ways in which the US has managed to stay as the world's largest economy. A lot of countries are moving away from the US dollar and choosing alternative currencies to trade in. So I think it's just pretty bad news if you live in the West.
So, Alex, what is your take on this? And I'm going to follow it up with I'm going to read a little article, a little piece of an article. So give me your assessment on what he was talking about in the state of the U.S. economy.
The crisis of the overhang of unpayable debts is usually what always unravels empires. And so the ruling establishment has two ways to solve the debts. Either they have to impose harsh, vicious austerity to try to repay those debts and to avoid accumulating more debts, cutting deficit spending by the government, for example. And if they pursue this venue, then they usually plunge the economy into a depression. The other venue is by printing more currency, which means that you continue to accumulate more debt. You spend the printed up currency into the economy, and you keep the economic activity alive. But you end up debasing the currency, and so that the currency ultimately collapses. And I think that pretty much 100% probability is that the United States government, but also all of the Western governments, will pursue the latter strategy, meaning that they will resort to the printing presses, that they're going to borrow and spend to infinity, and that they're going to end up generating very high rates of inflation and destroy the currency. This is simply because pursuing this strategy, if they imposed austerity, many banks would fail, many corporations would fail and go bankrupt, and their system, their financial and economic system, which is their lever of power, would collapse. If they pursue the money printing, then the currency collapses, which means that we all end up indirectly paying for this calamity. But it gives them time and maneuvering space, because with inflation, the progression of inflation can be gradual. The cycle could take 10 years or more to unravel. As like during the 1970s, we had pretty much a whole decade was inflationary, and it gives you the maneuvering space to try to finagle some kind of a soft landing. And so that's what's probably going to happen, is that we're going to see high levels of inflation. We're going to see the dollar gradually collapse. And we're going to see, unfortunately, most of the people experience a much, much lowered living standards.
Of this article right here on the Economic Collapse blog, it is titled "The Final Depressing Chapters for the Late Great U.S. Economy." And I'll just read a little bit of it, but I want your take on this, because the numbers and what is going on is just astonishing. It says, "It is incredibly sad to watch the U.S. economy slowly but surely come apart at the seams all around us. For most of our history, the rest of the world marveled at our economic performance, and that is because we embraced economic values that led to great blessing. In recent decades, we have abandoned those values, but were able to maintain a very high standard of living by going into unprecedented amount of debt. Our leaders were able to keep the game going for longer than a lot of people thought. But now we have entered the final depressing chapters for the late great U.S. economy, and we can see evidence of this all around us. If you doubt this, just look at all of the businesses that are going bankrupt. Last week, I discussed the fact that for the year ending June 30th, the number of business bankruptcy filings was up more than 40% compared to the previous 12 months. There is no way that the Biden administration can manipulate this number. Either a business filed for bankruptcy or it didn't. And right now we are seeing a spike of historic significance. On Sunday, CNBC published an article that listed 10 prominent restaurant chains that have filed for bankruptcy this year. Roti, Buca di Beppo, I don't know what that is. World of Beer, Rubio's, Milk Bar and Grill, Kuma's Corner, Red Lobster, Tijuana Flats, Sticky Fingers Joint, Boxer Ramen. We really are in the midst of a restaurant apocalypse, and more of our favorite eateries are getting in trouble with each passing day. For example, a large number of KFC locations just suddenly shut down in the Midwest. Dozens of KFC locations owned by one franchisee has abruptly closed across the Midwest. Up to 25 restaurants owned by major fast food franchisees, EYM Chicken, have shut in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, according to reports. The closure of several locations in Wisconsin will lead to nearly 100 employees being laid off, according to local media news. At one time, KFC was such a wonderful American success story, but now KFC restaurants are becoming an endangered species. There used to be one about an hour from where I live, but that one has been shut down too. And it goes on to say, he talks about the gas stations closing down. He talks about the banking system closing down. He even says, according to the Daily Mail, the U.S. lost 41 more bank branches in just one recent period, 2-week period. What is that telling us? But for the layman, for the average Joe on the street, Alex, what do you get from just that part of the article? And the article is long and it goes into way more stuff than that.
Well, it makes it very obvious that the system is in a recession and at risk of going into a depression. And I think that the reason, in large part, has been the Federal Reserve quantitative tightening program, and their normalization of their balance sheet, which means that they were trying to withdraw liquidity from the market, from the economy. And if you do that, then mathematically, a certain percentage of the participants in the economy, be it firms, be it individuals, are going to go bankrupt, because there's going to be insufficient liquidity to cover all the debts and pay all the bills that are due. So the weakest ones failed. If the Federal Reserve persists in this policy, then this process continues, and the economy doesn't stabilize until it reaches some kind of a baseline on a depression level of activities, where basically only the bare necessities are being traded between people. Kind of like bread and milk economy. Electricians, car repairmen, bus drivers, those people are going to have job, the postman and so forth. But pretty much, the small and medium-sized enterprises, the innovation, the economic growth, the export economy moves into a slow death. And so I think that's another reason why I think it's inevitable that the Fed's going to have to pivot. And, there are already signs that they will, and that they're going to have to, again, flood the economy with liquidity so that there's credit, so that businesses have credit to start their activities, create new markets for people to find jobs, to have purchasing power, and for the whole economic engine to be revved up again. The only problem is that if you're creating this liquidity and this money and credit and flooding it into the system based on nothing, based on just thin air, then you're going to create a lot of inflation. And so, you get, as a result, you kind of get a stagflation, where the economy is growing, but not really strongly. Prosperity isn't catching up with the economic activity. And then the currency starts to slowly die.
Well, this is not a symptom. Isn't this the disease? Aren't we watching not even the slow death, but the speeding up of the collapse of the so-called rules-based order, because the financial system is under immense strain and stress. The political system is under stress. And now we're looking at the Western world being challenged by the BRICS, by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and individually by Iran, China, Russia, Venezuela, and even Syria is challenging the rule of America by Assad still remaining in power. How can America and how can the West maintain their position when they don't have the manufacturing capability as they had after World War II? They don't have the economic might that they had when America became the richest country in the world. They don't have the political clout because they wasted it through these propaganda wars and these color revolutions. And now no one is taking them serious, and everybody is starting to form their own alliances outside of that. How can they continue on when they're antagonizing the very nations that they need to buy the debt to maintain the system?
Well, there could be several things that the United States government can do. To begin with, they could roll back the empire, because I think that the United States maintains something between 800 and 1,000 military bases all over the world. This is of no benefit to the American people whatsoever. It's only a cost, and it's a massive cost. So you say, like, okay, our freedoms are not in, Mauritania, in Niger, in Ukraine, in Germany, and so forth. So bring all those troops back home and save that money for domestic spending. Create domestic programs of fixing the infrastructure. The Chinese built 30,000 kilometers of 20,000 miles of high-speed railroads across China in the last, let's call it 15 years. I've listened to American politicians talking about high-speed railroads for at least since Bush 43, which means more than 20 years ago. And how many miles of high-speed railroads did the United States build? Very close to none. Some, yes, but I mean, we're literally talking like maybe 100 miles, something very ridiculous, like a little test thing. I forget where, but close to nothing. So, all the money that is being spent abroad on military bases, on bombs, on troops, on military contractors who sell toilet seats for $50,000 and things like this. All that money could buy, schools, hospitals, credit for businesses, infrastructure, high-speed railroads, repaired bridges, airports, and all these things. So that's one thing. Another move that is very radical, but it should be considered, is a debt jubilee. So there's, as this program you cited before said, Leon Cooperman says, the United States is going on to having $35 trillion in debt. Well, that's just public debt of the federal government. That doesn't even count state and local government debt. It doesn't count the private debts by financial and non-financial corporations. When you put all that together, the total credit market debt is, I think, something closer to $90 trillion. So that's something like 330% of the US GDP. That's preposterous. It's unpayable. And then you have another thing called the unfunded liabilities, which, depending on how you calculate it, comes to between $100 and $200 trillion. So if you take all that money together and you divide it by man, woman, and child living in the United States, you come to something like $500,000. It's not going to be paid back. So why not simply declare those debts unpayable, do a debt jubilee, a general debt forgiveness, and start from a blank slate? It's been done in history. It just hasn't been done under the Western civilizations, because the Western civilization has always been a hostage to money lending interests. And so is the United States today, and Britain and Europe and Japan and all of these Western nations. And this is where democracy comes in, because under democracy you can't have a debt jubilee, because you always have this money lending oligarchy that's above the democratic institutions. So you can have presidents and prime ministers and governors and all of these things that you want, but they can never challenge the ruling oligarchy. Whereas in the systems that we like to call tyrannies or autocracies, the leader of the country can actually line up these oligarchs and set them straight. Which is, we saw this happen in our lifetimes. In 2003, Vladimir Putin lined up all of Russia's oligarchs who thought they were above the law. He laid down the rules of the game. And then he said, like, if you don't like these rules, then you go elsewhere. One of them ended up in prison, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. But in the end, the oligarchs in Russia had to make peace with the fact that they're not above the law, that the political leadership is above them, and that they have to play according to the rules. And so, Russia, ever since Vladimir Putin took power, has been growing by leaps and bounds, practically on all metrics. Things have been improving dramatically. Standards of living have been improving. The GDP per capita, pensions, healthcare, all of that even to the point where the consumption of pharmaceutical drugs has been on a trend down because the population is actually growing more healthy and more fit. And, you know, in democracies, the money lending oligarchies are invisible. They are above, they are superior to the political process. And we just have, you know, the election democracy as an entertainment for the masses and as a way to string them along, you know, where they get betrayed and then they think like, oh, next time I'm going to vote for the left side, and then they get betrayed by the left side, and then they say, oh, next in 4 years I'm going to vote for the conservatives. And so, you know, like the cycle goes on, time goes on, people die, you know, decades pass. And then you look back and you find out that, like, strange how these democratic systems always deliver a lot of what we don't like, but never seem to be able to deliver things we do like. So, you know, safe streets, healthy population, prosperity, abundant jobs, healthy food, and all these things. We can never have that. But we can always have war and bombs and financial crises and homeless people and drugs and overdoses. We can have that in any kind of abundance that anybody could imagine.
Alex, before I let you go, I want to play a little clip for you, because this clip was back, I think it was either between 2012 and 2015. And you were just talking about the unfunded liabilities. And so this professor, he used to do the numbers, and he did the numbers back then, and he said the unfunded liabilities were $222 trillion. And I just want you to hear, and so it has to be forget the funny book accounting of America. If it was 222 trillion back then, it has to be a hell of a lot more nowadays. So I want you to listen to this real quick, and I'm not going to play the whole clip. I'll stop it, but I want you to listen to what he said.
Lawrence Kotlikoff, economics professor at Boston University. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's great to be with you, and great to be in Russia.
So you're the one who states that America is broke and is even in a worse state than Greece and Ireland. How so? What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, we economists look at all the bills the government has to pay, and in the U.S. case, we have enormous bills that have been kept off the books that are not official debts, but they're very real. For example, paying me my social security benefits, my old age pension, that's a real obligation. It's not part of official government debt, but it's, you know, very important because there are 78 million baby boomers who are going to get these social security payments, and in addition, medical payments from the government. If you look at all those payments, they're about $3 trillion a year. So we have these huge bills. Nobody has thought about paying for them. And Congress and the presidents over the years have just focused on official debt and basically have not told the public about these big bills.
You said the amount of the fiscal gap in the United States is, in your estimation, $222 trillion. Is this right?
$222 trillion. If you take...
This is like an astonishing number, which is like 3 times the world's GDP. This is more than what the world makes.
20 times higher than the official debt in the hands of the public, which is 11 trillion. So if you add all these spending obligations into the distant future, and you compare them with all the taxes, and you include in the spending all the interest payments and principal payments on the debt, on the official debt, you have 222 trillion in present value. Now this is 12% of GDP on an ongoing basis. In other words, we need to get 12% more of GDP, either in tax increases or spending cuts, in order to have the fiscal gap be zero. We're doing far too little too late. It's like operating on a person with cancer, and you say, well, there's a big tumor here. We're just going to take a little bit out today, and we'll come back in 5 years, and we'll take out some more. But maybe in 5 years, the patient is dead. because the tumor got bigger. So this is why we are in worse shape than Greece. And Greece, it's about 10% of GDP they need on an ongoing basis. We need 12%. Italy, it's about 5%. Germany, it's about 5%. So when you look at it from this perspective, it's a whole different story than when you look just at the official debt. Because these governments are making choices, word choices, about what to call official obligations and what to call unofficial.
So are they intentionally hiding the
They're
enormity
intentionally
of the
hiding
problem?
this. They've been spending, in our country, 6 decades running a massive Ponzi scheme, taking from young people, giving to old people, and then telling the young people, don't worry, you'll get yours when you're old. Promising pensions, promising healthcare benefits. And, you know, this is happening in all countries. Even Russia has a pension system, but it doesn't seem to be in as bad a shape as ours in terms of paying for its benefits in the future.
But I mean, this number, 222 trillion, I mean, what exactly is this, where is this money going? Who is spending it? I mean, certainly not the average American. What is it, like the 1% of the super rich, the military needs? Where's it going?
Where's all the spending?
Yeah.
Well, you have, again, you've got a lot of old people now. They're getting very high benefits, about $30,000 per person. It's scheduled to go up to about $40,000 when I retire, which will be about 15 years. So you can see that we're just very generous to the old people in our country.
What do you suggest? Like cut spending, raise taxes? That would be suicidal to any American president.
Well, we have to be adults. If we're running the country, we have to act like adults because our main responsibility as adults is to make sure our kids have a good future. So we have to reduce the growth rate of the benefits to the elderly. And that requires cutting the growth, being much more careful about how much we spend on health care, because it's been the health care benefits have been growing at.
Do you hear me, Rashid? You're muted.
Okay, I don't understand why it was acting like. Well, I do understand. StreamYard is probably bothering both of our microphones, but what is your take on that? That was back then $222 trillion.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to correct myself because I said that it came to about 500,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States. So I use my calculator. It comes to about $740,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States. I took those 222 trillion and I assumed that back then the population was closer to 300 million. Today it's supposedly at 330 million. So to a population of 300 million, that's $740,000. I think that less than half of the US population are actually employed. So then you can double that. So that's like $1.5 million in unfunded liabilities per employee. And then if you wanted to even reduce that, because a lot of those employees are working for the government as the biggest growth industry now, or they're working in private enterprise, but as government contractors. So if you wanted to reduce this down to strictly private enterprise working in the open market, I think you're going to end up at a number that's above $2 million per person. That obviously cannot be paid back. Whatever you do, you can tax people more, you can reduce spending, but it just can't be done. So you're going to have either a debt jubilee, so to write off most of those debts, and at the very least, the public debts should be capable of being written off. Private debts maybe with a bit more difficulty, and then what the government is going to do in the end, they're going to default through inflation. They're just going to print up the currency needed to meet all those obligations, the the pensions, the payments to the veterans, and healthcare, Medicaid, Medicare. All of those things are going to be paid for with money printed out of thin air, and what you're going to get out of that is inflation. And so the US dollar is going to meet the same end as every fiat currency before it. It's practically a mathematical inevitability. The only question is how long this is going to take. Because through history, we had episodes where the debasement of money took a very, very long time, practically decades. In the case of Roman Empire, it took practically 2 centuries. But we also had historical episodes where it happened practically overnight. So in 100 years ago, Weimar Republic in Germany, the money collapsed in the space of about 8 or 9 months to zero practically. And in the same in Soviet Union, it was really overnight. They in 1990 January 1, 1992, or February 1, 1992, they simply abolished price controls from one day to the next, and the inflation shot up by 500% overnight, and then over the coming months it went to over 3,000%. So we don't know what trajectory the crisis might follow, whether it's going to be faster, whether it's going to be more gradual. But for sure, the government is going to resort to printing presses to meet its debt obligations, and the result is going to be the debasement of the dollar.
And before you go off there, I would say this to you, that the United States dollar has been in a tailspin for the longest. Most people, they look at this, what's going on now, and they start thinking, well, it's in a stage that is falling. But I want to go back to something. They had been debasing the dollar in the 60s. Think about this. They started robbing the coins of the silver in the 60s, so that the quarters and the dimes no longer had a silver content in them by 65. And then by 70, the half dollars and the dollars no longer had silver content in them. And then that led us to the 71, where America defaulted on its debt by taking the world off the gold and silver standard. And then they came up with some scheme to keep it going for a little longer by this petrodollar. And I think that is the last leg of the dollar, and we're seeing nations walking away from it. So I believe that we're in the last stage of the collapse. A lot of people think that we're in the beginning of the collapse, but I think that we're in the last stages of it, because the collapse started its progression in the 60s, and it's only picking up steam as we can see. What say you on the matter before we leave?
Well, I just want to be fair to, you're referring to Richard Nixon on 15 August 1971, when he severed the convertibility of the US dollar to gold. But, to be fair, he said it was only temporary. So, they just didn't come around to restoring that link anymore, No, but Rashid, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And, the dollar has pretty much lost 99% of its purchasing power since 1913. And 1913 is a date that everybody should know. That's the date when Federal Reserve came into existence. And 1913 was also the last year when Americans didn't pay any income tax, because the very next year, income tax was introduced. Just a little temporary thing, 1%, because there was this war raging in Europe. It was an emergency, and it was incumbent on the American people to make the world safe for democracy. So, what's a little 1% temporary income tax? It never went away. And it's only grown bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's all been a grand deception. And I think that if this system has to fall, then good riddance. But we should try to learn and understand how the economy works, how money operates, what money is, what it represents, what it shouldn't represent. We should try to understand the system of credit creation, of allocation of credit to productive use, productive purposes, rather than speculation, buying houses and selling it to each other with the money borrowed from the Chinese or printed from thin air. Rather investing into infrastructure, into industries, production of things that actually make people's lives better. So we need to learn about this so that the system we can create for the future generations is actually something that we would want our children to live with.
Alex, once again, thank you, my friend, for coming on, for giving me, you gave me way more than an hour. Man, I really, really appreciate it, Alex.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, Rashid.
Likewise, man. Hey, be safe, be blessed, and I'll get in contact with you.
Thank you very much.
All right, bye-bye.
Take care.
Everybody, everybody listen, hit the like button. Please hit the like button. I continue to try, by the grace of God, I'm going to try to bring you the top-notch guests. I'm working on some surprises for you all, for channel members and for patrons. I'm working on a few things. Hopefully, if it's the will of God, it'll come through. Also, for just the viewers, I'm working on a few things. We're going to keep on bringing you the truth no matter what. And I want you to do your part by hitting that like button, hitting that subscribe button, because we know that sometimes you get unsubscribed. For some reason, on this channel, you get unsubscribed. So listen, share this stuff. I see Wake Bong says this right here. He says, awesome show. Big thanks to both. Man, thank you for joining me. Listen, I do this because the duty of a civilized man or woman is to teach civilization to the uncivilized, or to enlighten those who are civilized and who may have forgotten. So this is why I do this. It's my duty. And I'm asking you to do yours, and let's grow the show. Let's grow the platform. Go and subscribe to all of the platforms. We're on Twitter. We're on Odyssey. We're on Rumble, Locals, Twitch, or whatever. And our backup channel is the Red Pill Journals on YouTube. Please support us. And I thank every one of you for giving me your time today, because that's the most precious and most valuable commodity that everybody treasures. Because once your time is over or up, you can never get that time back again. So I hope that you spending your time with me has given you an equal or greater return in knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. On that note, know that I love each and every one of you who loves truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that the true and living God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, stay righteous. And remember, do right by others, not because other people are watching, but because it's the right thing to do. Because even when others are not watching, the Almighty is always watching. Have respect and love for the Almighty. And if you have that respect, it'll carry on to your respect and love for other people. Hey, mama, guess what? Your baby boy loves you more than life. Everybody, thank you all from the bottom of my heart to the depth of my soul. We're out of here. Deuces, everybody. Peace.